As I mentioned earlier, everyone has at least some access to every cognitive function. However, the ones your mind deems most important are what defines what your personality type is. There are a few different models out there for laying out how your mind prefers to use different cognitive functions. But I think the best one that seems most grounded while also touching upon every aspect of your personality is John Beebe's 8-function model. That said, we want a model that is as accurate and useful as possible while also being easy to understand. With this in mind, for 95% of the people watching this, I'd recommend that really only focusing on the first 4 cognitive functions of your function stack is probably a good idea. So while I'll be using the structure of John Beebe's 8-function model, I'm going to save the 5th through 8th function for bonus and future module videos. The last 4 functions largely show up as reflections of the first 4 functions anyway, and so you can pretty much holistically describe people using only their first 4 functions anyway. Okay, let's get into it. Here we have the top 4 slots where we have our 4 most consciously used cognitive functions. The names of these function slots might seem a bit ridiculous, but they actually do serve a useful purpose in giving you a characterization of how that function shows up in that slot. They all have multiple names that people use to describe them as well, which I'll list out for you, but what's shown here is how I typically refer to them. All right, starting at the top, we have the hero function, also called the dominant function, the driver function, or the primary function. This is the function you're the most innately talented at using. You naturally identify yourself around it, and it almost always feels like it's the right tool for any job. That is, it's like you're a golden hammer and everything looks like a nail to it. The hero term is to denote how it pretty much feels capable of taking on anything, as if it's the main protagonist of your mind. Using this function gives you energy, and engaging with it fully puts you into a state of flow. As such, on the flip side, if life circumstances or external pressures prevent you from using this function, you can get very depressed. You simultaneously can have a lot of confidence in this function, but also a slight bit of comparative insecurity around using it, particularly when you're young, because it is largely how you define and value yourself. So if someone is using it better than you, you can feel comparatively insecure about that. Generally though, of all functions, you are the most emotionally compelled to use this function, and it gives you the best kickback or reward for using it. As a result, many people enjoy spending almost all of their time using this function, at least in part, and that can leave them relatively unbalanced because they don't learn to incorporate the benefits of other cognitive functions. By the way, quick terminology note. The attitude of a cognitive function is whether it is introverted or extroverted. The attitude of introverted thinking, for instance, is introverted. Whatever the attitude is of your hero function is what labels you holistically as an introvert or an extrovert. And you might be able to see why. If your hero function is where you derive energy from and where you get into a flow state by using and are more or less just obsessed with, then this natural preference for your hero function's attitude will strongly color your overall introversion or extroversion. The way cognitive functions express themselves when they're in the hero slot are very similar to how I described them in the previous 2 videos, as this is the most pure expression of a cognitive function you'll get anywhere in the function stack. All right, moving on to function number 2, we have the parent function, also called the good parent function, the auxiliary function, or copilot function. This is the function you have the second highest natural talent at using. However, it's also a function that you tend not to feel a strong compulsion towards using. The simplest reason for that being that the attitude of this function is the opposite of the attitude of your hero function. That is, if your hero function is introverted, your parent function will be extroverted, and vice versa. The reason it's called the parent or good parent function is because the way it tends to show up is in a nurturing or protective fashion, both in balancing out your own cognition and in helping others. Here's a scenario to illustrate that. Let's say that your hero function is introverted thinking, which, remember, is all about subjective logical reasoning. TI Hero loves to solve any and all problems using logic and is extremely confident in all of its own logical conclusions. Sometimes, though, it can get stuck in those own conclusions and closed off to outside opinions. If you have extroverted intuition as a parent function, however, and you push yourself to actually use it, then it might balance your thinking process a bit. Remember that any is the function that constantly asks, what if this? What if that? In an effort to seek out all possibilities. Your any parent could balance out your TI Hero by asking the very important question, okay, but what if you're wrong? What if there's some extra data that might make you come to a different conclusion? Let's take another example with extroverted thinking as the hero function. Remember that TE is all about achieving goals and setting up systems to get things done. So with TE hero, you're extremely driven to get stuff done and are incredibly industrious, and also have no patience for other people's laziness and can get very frustrated with them. In this case, a parent function of introverted sensing could help balance you out. Remember that SI is all about looking into your past memories and how we are all the culmination of our past experiences. SI parent might allow you to have that impatience lessened a bit, because you know just how impactful other people's individual circumstances and experiences are to how they show up today. You grow a greater sense of sympathy for people showing up differently than you because you're keenly aware of how different people's upbringings are. In every personality type, there's an example of this balancing act that takes place between the hero function and the parent function. The hero function wanting to quickly and heroically save the day and solve every problem, with the parent function creating a more balanced perspective that is often innately oriented in a servicing fashion. The part of you that wants to take care of yourself and others to be more mature and balanced is expressed through your parent function. As a part of this, the parent function is often a bit more cautiously pessimistic than the hero function is, asking more, "Are you sure?" and "Have we really thought this through?" or "Is this really what we should be doing?" type of questions. Again though, I want to stress that it can actually be kind of hard to use the parent function because it forces you to give less absolute power to the hero function, which you are emotionally compelled to do. However, once you get into the practice of using it and building skill with it, you'll unlock that innate talent for it and begin to approach things with a more balanced and mature perspective. Based on everything I just mentioned, you can see that cognitive functions in the parent slot show up quite differently than in the hero slot. And given that not everybody activates their parent function willingly, it won't always show up in stereotypical manifestations of different personality types. Okay, let's move on to function number 3, the child function, or the eternal child, 10-year-old, or simply tertiary function. This function is one that barely ever emotionally matures past the level of a 10-year-old child. That is, it can be energetic and optimistic, and even quite sure of itself, but ultimately isn't that innately talented or skillful. It usually lacks the scope and depth of a hero function, and often can also be a trigger for our most defensive behaviors. In fact, we tend to overestimate our skill in this function and often end up trying to use it beyond its capabilities. Then, when we get criticized for doing so, we get a bit defensive. We do actually tend to really enjoy using our child functions though, and we use them a lot because they share an attitude with our hero function. In fact, a very common behavioral pattern our minds fall into is where our hero and child functions loop in on each other. We stay comfortably in our attitude of choice and also typically seek immediate enjoyment and block out any outside or internal signals that might be telling us that what we're doing isn't that great for us. For example, if your hero function is introverted thinking and your child function is introverted sensing, you might continuously reinforce your own perspective on things, and anything that falls outside of your currently held opinions on things gets summarily ignored. These two introverted functions will just keep looping in on each other, ignoring outside evidence or suggestion. Your introverted sensing might make you want to stay home and play video games because you love staying home and playing video games. Your introverted thinking might rationalize this behavior with logic like, well, video games are a guaranteed good time. And if life is just an amalgamation of individual moments, why not try to maximize the individual enjoyment of those as much as you can? Video games do that. Your friends might encourage you to go out to some social event, but your TI-SI loop will deem that illogical because you remember that one time you had a bad experience at a social event, and why bother going through all that nonsense when you can just have guaranteed fun here at home? The hero and child function will basically just keep high-fiving each other because they totally agree with each other and block out outside opinions. Note that in this scenario, the parent function would be extroverted intuition, and if you could force yourself to listen to it by breaking the loop, it might encourage you to go out. It might express something along the lines of, you don't know what type of meaningful experience you might have, and it might turn into an opportunity for something that makes your life way better or teach you something that makes you smarter. Every personality type has an example of this looping behavior between the first and third functions, and in each case, the solution is always to get into your parent function to disengage the loop. All right, we finally get to function number 4, the inferior function. It's also sometimes called the anima or animus. This is a function we don't really get along with. This is because we have an innate sense that it's no good, and we're not good at using it. Emotionally speaking, this function is like a 3-year-old infant, lacking sophistication or skill in how it expresses itself, but nevertheless requiring care and attention every so often. The reason why we feel so negatively about this function is because it is, in fact, on the opposite end of a cognitive polarity with our hero function. That is, if our hero function is TI, our inferior is FE, and vice versa. If our hero function is NE, our inferior function is SI, and vice versa, and so on and so forth. Because we're wired to value our hero function so heavily, that comes with the necessary consequence of devaluing and often genuinely disliking engaging with its opposite polarity. By the way, just as a side note, the parent function and child function are also on a cognitive polarity with each other, although they are not nearly as polarized as the hero and inferior polarity. This is part of the reason why the parent and child functions show up in such complementary ways too, with one being very responsible and slightly pessimistic, and the other being quite irresponsible and more optimistic. Anyway, back to the inferior function. It tends to be the seat of many of our biggest insecurities, and also where we are most sensitive to criticism and worry. It's almost always energetically taxing to use this function for almost any length of time. However, as we grow and mature, we begin to incorporate small elements of our inferior function into how we use our hero function. Although early on, we usually tend to find people who use our inferior function as their hero function a bit exhausting, we can also grow to be quite impressed by it. In fact, as you balance yourself out, you'll often find yourself growing a greater appreciation and even an aspiration for this function. All right, so let's zoom out and make some observations. Firstly, we can see that these first four functions are really made up of two cognitive polarities. In each personality type, one of these polarities has to be a judging polarity, and the other has to be a perceiving polarity. So, within these confines, you can see that we have four different polarities that can be ranged in two different ways. We can have FE to TI, or TI to FE, NE to SI, or SI to NE, that type of thing. And each of those configurations can be matched up with the two other polarities, leading to 4 times 2 times 2 equals 16 possible personality types. Another interesting thing to keep note of is that each function has a different level of emotional compulsion to use it. Our hero function is the most compulsively used, then our child function, then our parent function, and finally our inferior. However, in terms of natural talent in using a function, the order is more sequential. It goes hero, parent, child, and then inferior. As a side note, our natural talent in our parent function often goes underutilized. But if you truly do put in the work to fully incorporate it, the reward signaling can often reconfigure itself such that your parent function does in fact become more compulsive to use than your child function. But realistically, most people don't push themselves out of their comfort zone enough for that to happen. You can though. All right, that was a lot. And if you're particularly inquisitive, you might have been left with a few questions as well, like, why do we need to have one judging and one perceiving polarity? What about the last four functions? How do these functions actually work in the brain? Or maybe you're even wondering, what is a cognitive function? Like scientifically speaking, what is TI? What is FE? I'll cover these type of questions as best I can in future videos and future modules. Next up though, we finally get to the part where we see where all of this stuff that we've been covering ties into those 4-letter personality type codes that you see all over the internet.